G'day, I'm James, and I've got an app right here, which, well, if we load it up, it looks kind of shit. But let me make one tiny little change here. Holy cow, do 6 characters make a difference? So today I'm going to be walking you through the process of taking this fresh Create React App project and then building the styles and markup for this beautiful landing page. And while it would be totally possible to learn the same stuff using a bunch of much simpler, more boring styles, I think it's really important to get familiar with the process of styling stuff, because the thing about apps and websites is that the people who are using them are human. Humans like pretty things, they like personality, and they like it when your app tells a story. But okay, you already know that styles are important. What you probably want to know is how is it that those 6 characters at the beginning of the video could make such a huge difference to the app's styles? And the answer has something to do with a tool called styled components. So in this video, I'm going to teach you everything that you need to know about styled components to build this landing page over here. So first things first, before using styled components, you're going to have to install it. And if you're following along from the previous lesson of React and Bacon, or if you've just initialized a fresh Create React App project, then this is really simple. All you need to do is open up your terminal and then type in npm install styled-components. And then let's add save, just so that the styled components dependency will be saved in package.json. And then once that's installed and you've started the server again, you should just be able to import it and use it. So let's give that a try. So let's start by adding the markup for the page title. So to do that, I'm just going to remove the default markup generated by Create React App and replace that with a h1 tag with the title. And then let's just remove this unneeded logo, and we'll remove app.css and index.css too, just so that the app can be completely styled by styled components. Then let's just import the CSS function from styled-components, and we can use that function within the CSS prop. So let's add a CSS prop to h1, and then we can just add anything. So let's add a text align center, and if I save this, what you'll see is that it doesn't actually work. And this is what you'd expect actually, because, well, JavaScript and JSX don't have a CSS prop. And while they do have a style prop, which I could use to accomplish the same thing, the problem with the style prop is it's not as flexible as CSS, and it kind of makes you context switch into a different way of thinking about styles. So we don't really want to do that. And we could use class name as well, as you saw earlier, but really it would be nice if we could just pass in CSS attributes. And the thing is, when you think about it, JSX itself isn't actually understood by the browser. It needs to be compiled into JavaScript before your browser can make sense of it. And so to cut a long story short, Create React App, which I'm using to build this app, it lets you hook into its JavaScript compiler called Babel using a tool called Babel Macros. And that makes it possible to configure Babel so that it also understands CSS props, and doing so is surprisingly easy. All you need to do is change where you import stuff from. So if we import this from styled component / macro instead, and save it, you'll see that the styles all work now. So as you know, setting the font with CSS is really simple. All you need to do is add a font family attribute, and then you can set the font to basically anything you like. So if I just set this to impact, you'll see that that all works. The only trick here is that this only works if the font is on the user's device, and unfortunately a lot of fonts aren't. For example, say we want to use the Bonji Shade font. If I was actually to set this font in the font family and set sans serif as a backup, then if we have a look back at the app, then, well, this isn't the font I just showed you, and that's because that font isn't on my machine. And so in this case, we're actually going to need to tell the browser where to fetch the font from. And so this font is available on Google Web Fonts. And while there's a number of different ways to import it, I like to use the CSS import statement. The only problem with import is it has to go at the top level. You can't add it to a CSS prop, and you can't add it to a CSS selector. So we're going to need some way to add styles to the top level as well as just to elements. And luckily, styled components makes this pretty easy. All we need to do is import the create global style function. And then this function returns a component. So let's create a global style component by calling create global style. And I can just copy and paste this import statement in here. And then the other thing I need to do is, because this is a component, I actually have to render it. So let's add a global style element to our page. And if I save this now, you'll see that that all works. So yeah, the global style or create global style function is a lot like a style tag. So you can actually add plain selectors to it as well. So for example, I could add a body selector and I could use that to set the background color. Red is really easy to see, so you can see that this works, but I'm going to set it to something a little nicer. And while we're at it, let's just set a few more styles. So you can use the wildcard selector. And let's do that to set box sizing to border box, because that just makes things a whole lot easier to reason about. And I'm also going to set a HTML selector, and I'm going to set the font size in that to 16 pixels. So that will now be the value of 1 rem. Then I'm just going to set a few kind of standard things in body. So let's just set the margin, and let's set a default font family. I'm going to use Railway, which is actually in that import statement up there. And let's just set font size and align height. And there we go. And speaking of font size, that's actually how I implemented the shaped text effect up here. So let's see how we can do that. So one of the most useful features of styled components is that it lets you use JavaScript variables within your styles. And this has all sorts of uses, like you can use it for theming and mix-ins and media queries, but it's also useful for a lot of simpler stuff. So for example, if you have a list of elements or items, then you can style the elements based on their position within the list. So I'm going to demonstrate this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this title here, and I'm going to turn that into a list of spans. So let me grab this string here and move that out to a variable. Then what I can do is I can use array.from to convert that string into an array of characters. Then I can just map over it and grab each character and its index. And then I can create a span for each of those. And then the last thing I want to do is make sure that I'm setting a key. So if I save that, you'll see that nothing's changed, and that's because rendering a list of spans is basically the same as rendering the text itself. The only difference is that now I can add a CSS prop. So let's do that. Let's add a CSS prop here, and I can set anything, but let's just set the font size. And because this is a template string, I can interpolate things into it. So let's just do something simple based on the index and the title length. Let's make this in M. So if I save this, you'll see that it all works. The characters actually, the size depends on their position within the list. And it's not exactly the shape that we're aiming for, but you know, it shows you that it works. And I'm going to finish that off. But before I do, there's one thing that I really need to warn you about. And that's that you do not want to interpolate user input. Now, it's okay to interpolate constant things. So using title or title.length, that's fine because it's a constant, it's baked in. And the index here, the I, this is variable, but it's still based on a constant. It's still baked into the code, so this is fine too. But what you don't want to interpolate, at least without escaping it, is anything that the user has entered. So for example, you need to be really careful if you ever want to let the user set things like background images or colors. And I've linked an article that goes into some more details on this below, but in this case, we're not doing any of that, so we're okay. So let's just finish this off with a bit of math. And I'm going to just copy and paste this math off of my notes because it's a little complicated. So here I go. I'm just going to copy and paste the font size. We can see it's really long. And if I save this, oh, that's big. So the other thing here is because the font size is set in ems, I can adjust the size just by setting the font size of its parent. So let's set this to say 0.35 rems. And if I save that, there we go. It's starting to come together nicely. And you know, it could use a little color, but I'm going to leave that to you as an exercise. And I've put some details on that in the course material with hints and a solution. So I'd really recommend that you give that a go after the video. But for now, the title is at least laid out correctly, so let's move on to the rest of the screen. So our landing page's content is mostly contained within this card looking thing here. And you've probably seen cards like this before. They're a pretty common sight within modern web applications. So I guess it would make sense to implement this as a component. So let's create a card component. And I'm just going to create this as a standard React function component. So let's just throw in a div and then pass through the children. Because it's a div, I can add styles with a CSS prop. So let's do that, and I'm just going to copy and paste the styles from my notes. They're all on GitHub, so you can take a look later if you'd like. And then the last thing to do is to actually render the card. So there we go. That works. It doesn't look particularly pretty. This version with a narrower card and with the horizontal centering is a lot nicer. So let's add that with a CSS prop too. So let's do this. And let's do a little bit of margin, and margin auto makes sure that it's horizontally centered. Then let's just add a max width as well. So let's make it 340 pixels. And if I save that, you'll see that it doesn't actually work. So let's do a little quiz. Do you know why it doesn't work? I'm going to give you a few seconds of bacon sound, so take a think about it. Okay, so the reason that this CSS prop here isn't actually working is, if you remember, CSS props don't really exist. So what actually happens is the styled components macro, which we're importing up here, at compile time, it takes the CSS prop and it transforms it into a plain old class name prop. So while it looks like we're passing a special CSS prop into this card component, what we're actually doing is just passing a class name. And if you take a look at the card, you'll see that we're not rendering the class name, and that's why the styles aren't working. So to fix this, it's nice and easy. We just need to render the class name. And while you could do that as a separate class name prop, I'm just going to pass through all of the props using the JSX spread syntax. That'll also pass through children, so we don't need that anymore. And if I save it, you'll see that it all works now. We have this nice styled card component. The confusing thing is we don't have a styled component in the sense of the styled components library, and that's a little bit difficult to explain, so I'm just going to show you. So styled components' default export is this styled object. And styled contains a bunch of things which you can use with ES6 template literals. So what we can do is we can call style.div and then pass all of the styles through, and that'll return a component just like the one we wrote. So if I save this, this works exactly the same way as defining the component by yourself. And of course, it's not just style.div. You also have style.span and style.footer and style.anything really. So just so you know, you can also interpolate props into these styled components too. I'll give you a couple examples of that in the course materials. So a landing page needs to collect email addresses. That's kind of the whole point of it. And to do that, you're going to need an input. So let's create a component for it. So I'm going to call my component styled input, which is not a very inventive name, but it's a bit of a convention which people use just so that they don't have to pick new names for each component. And then let me just copy in some styles. Again, these are all on GitHub, so you can take a look later if you'd like. Now, once I've got the component, I'm going to have to throw it inside of the card. So let's add a styled input. And because all of the props are passed through, I can still do things like set type equals email. And I can also set autofocus. So if I click over here, it's automatically focused and it's all nice and working. There's just one problem, and that's the square outline here. So if I unfocus this, you'll see that the border radius is actually quite large. And then if I focus it again, it's kind of hard to see, but you can actually see the border inside of the outline. And the problem is you can't actually set an outline radius on a CSS outline. The best you can do is fake it with box shadow and a focus selector. So let me do that over here. So to do this, what I'm going to do is type in ampersand focus, and I'm going to come back to that ampersand in a sec. And then I can just add outline none. If I do this and then click over here, you'll see that the outline is gone. Of course, that's terrible because it's bad for accessibility and it just makes it hard to use for everyone. So what we need to do is fake it with a box shadow. So I'm going to grab this box shadow and copy it and paste. And if I save that, you'll see that now we have this nice rounded box shadow and it all works. So let me come back to this ampersand though, because the thing about the ampersand here is that it's not actually CSS. And if you've used Sass or less before, then it's probably kind of familiar. But just in case you haven't, the ampersand kind of acts as a CSS selector for the current element. And then you can extend it with pseudo selectors like focus here, or you can set it to hover. And you can also nest more selectors underneath of it. And you can also use this for CSS props, so it's not just for styled components. So basically all we're doing here is nesting selectors and using this special current element selector, just like you'd do in Sass or less. In fact, ampersands aren't the only type of selectors which you can nest. You can actually nest basically anything. So every website needs a footer. Well, maybe it doesn't need a footer, but it feels like every website has a footer, so let's just add one. And I'm going to use a footer tag because, oh, it's a once-off. We don't need to reuse it. It doesn't need to be a component. So then let me just copy some content in. You already know how to write content. You don't need to see me do that as well. There we go. It looks kind of ugly, but it works. So let's add a CSS prop with some styles. And I'm just going to copy the styles across too. There you go. It all works, except I don't like the color of those links. I think they should be gray. You know, we could argue over this all day, but the problem is that if we wanted to say set a CSS prop on the anchor tags, it would be repeating yourself. And I don't like repeating myself. And you know, you could fix that by putting the color in a variable and then interpolating it in or something like that, but it's still kind of repeating yourself. Or you could even use something really fancy like React context and a separate component, but again, I mean, this is a once-off footer component. It doesn't have to be reusable. That's a lot of work. So let's just do the quick and dirty thing and nest some selectors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an ampersand to refer to the current element, which is a footer. And then I'm going to use an A to refer to all of the nested links. Then let's just copy the color in. And there you go. Okay, so you've built a landing page, or half of one. But while this little app doesn't look like much, it actually includes all of the concepts from styled components that you'd need to finish off the app so that it looks like this. And while I've only briefly covered how all of this works in this video, the course materials go into a lot more detail. So they include a bunch of articles and interactive exercises. They include a work solution video where I'll walk you through everything you need to get from here all the way to here. And the other thing that the course material covers is media queries, which are really important if you ever want to make something that works on both mobile and desktop. So I'd highly recommend you check that out. Now, there's a lot more to styled components that I haven't covered. So if you want to take a look through all the details yourself, the styled components documentation website is really good. So I've linked that below. But with that said, there's one thing in particular that I think you will want to learn at some point, which is animations. So I'm going to be going into that in another lesson right after we've got the app deployed and we've got the form working. So it's going to be in, I think, a few lessons time. But I'm getting ahead of myself here because if you really want to make bacon, then you're going to need something that is prettier than this. So whether you take this and build your own landing page, or whether you just follow along with the course material and build the contributants landing page, the only way you're really going to learn this stuff is by getting your hands dirty. So I can't wait to see what you build. I'm James K. Nelson. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.